You're going to start out by adding my Patreon to the chat, and it's also in the bottom of my description of today's thing. Now we're going to basically just be looking at a hypothetical today. I know that's kind of a little bit odd, but we're going to be looking at the best option for peace, because when we look at what's happened with the discussions of the summit, it really boiled down to what on the peace summit between Kim and Trump, we see that it was through added on things that National Security Advisor Bolton put on the table that caused the real breakdown. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the idea of what's the best option for peace is to dismiss, either keep or dismiss National Security Advisor Bolton. And when you keep this hypothetical out there, is this has been kind of run out there for in the more liberty-based crowd, because the fact is what has been going on for a while with what he's done is his idea was to essentially sabotage the any type of peace between U.S. And North Korea, or U.S. and Russia. Try to intervene in as many places as possible. Try to destroy any possibility of peace between the U.S. and Iran. Try to destroy any possibility of peace between the U.S. and Venezuela, because they don't want an actual peace situation there. Name an actual leader that would be basically linked with a lot of regime change, which would be Juan Guaido. And when we start to look at this, you'll see that this goes back to the idea of that he's not exactly a person that wants peace. Look at John Bolton's history. You're going to see that he was one of the ones perpetuating the lies of the Iraq War. It was him. It was Dick Cheney. It was also, when we look at the idea of going with Colin Powell, and then you had Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was also the other one. When we look at these people, you had Cheney was making money through Halliburton on the war, which is very, very shady at best. You had, when we look at the whole thing, you had, if we're talking about having a private server for your for holding your information in a private email service, we have the case of Colin Powell was doing it right before Hillary Clinton was. He was doing the exact same thing. Then we go to the case of John Bolton. Obviously, with it, he knew that just like all the other intelligence people, he knew that all these things were fake, and he was basically essentially just like a lot of other people, he was essentially getting kickbacks from the defense people because he had investments in these groups. So he was essentially making money from any type of military action. So it was essentially in his best interest to send people to die. And then when it came to Benjamin Netanyahu is essentially a neoconservative warmonger that loves to remake the Middle East, and we know all the things that he's in with his with the corruption that he's in, and that he's going to be removed from office, and that he's getting ready to be bumped. And that he's getting ready to go when it comes down to everything, and he's pretty much out the door because he's a corrupt individual. He's basically as corrupt as Barack Obama was. So when we look at this, we could see that the history of John Bolton is basically that he pretty much is as entrenched in this idea of regime change as anybody else. With it, he pretty much wants to. He does not want to bog the country down with this idea of peace, because peace he feels is a negative. And so if we look at the idea of what's the best option for peace, it's not going to be John Bolton, because he feels that it ties the country's hands. Now, if we look at this, would mean that for the best option in this hypothetical, it should mean that we should want him to go. And that's something that's actually a very big positive that on this hypothetical, because when we start to look at what he's actually done with the Trump administration, he's essentially causing us to delay this pullout from Syria that should happen immediately. We should not even be bombing out there, number one. Number two is using white phosphorus. When we start to actually look for that, you'll actually realize that white phosphorus itself is really a chemical weapon. And if you start to look at the actual impacts of what white phosphorus does to people that have been hit with it, if they're pregnant, it'll cause massive birth defects. Number one. Number two, it causes massive burns for the people, and this is basically a horrible, horrible way to die. This isn't just like a regular explosive, and that's what we're using, and basically that's what Israel tends to use. So when we're talking about horrible things to be using, we should never be using white phosphorus bombing. That should be the last possible idea we should ever be thinking about. And if we're going to create where we're going to be viewing ourselves as basically living on a higher standard, we should never be using anything like this. This is about the same thing as bombing with anthrax. And if we're talking about the use of chemical weapons, if we're trying to blame that on Assad when there wasn't any evidence, essentially that's what we're doing. We're essentially bombing with chemical weapons. That's exactly what white phosphorus is. And I don't know if there's a UN ban on it, but frankly, I believe that there should be, because frankly, with all the damage it does to people from the actual usage, is we need to understand that conventional weaponry is just fine when it comes down to your actual goals. The purpose of using white phosphorus is completely illegitimate. It's the difference between using a traditional missile and using a nuke. The idea of a nuke becomes completely illegitimate, because you're not doing any more damage. The only idea of holding a nuke nowadays is for basically starving off interventionist countries that are trying to essentially kill you, and that's the only purpose. For countries that are interventionists, there is no legitimate purpose for holding a nuke as well, such as the United States, such as Israel. They have no, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Pakistan. None of these countries have any legitimate purpose to hold a nuke, such as France, England. No purpose to have a nuke. But when we get back to this argument, is when we start to look at it, you'll see that he has a liberal foreign foreign policy perspective, which means he does believe in intervention. He does believe that he can form these countries in this idealistic formation, and doesn't believe in any ideas of blowback from this. Now, when we look at this, you're not going to get any type of idea of what would be realistic, because frankly, we look at the more times you attack, the more times you intervene, the amount of terrorism goes up. And we saw this specifically during the Obama administration, that terrorism spiked to a massive height. And this is because of the amount of bombing campaigns and the amount of area that we were attacking, the amount of countries we were attacking, and it was just a fact of what we were doing. So the more we such an idea is basically insane to think that we're not going to have the same problems. Now, if we look at the hypothetical option against that for a replacement, which would be Tulsi Gabbard, and the reason why I picked her with it is because this is the one that Austin Petersen floated around. I feel that that's would be a good option, and that's since she's running for president as well, with it as being the only realistic option on the Democratic side. It would actually shoe in Trump as well for the Republican office, because he would be eliminating any type of reasonable option on the Democratic side from winning. And what this would do, this would essentially give you someone from the obviously you wouldn't be getting someone from the identity perspective, which would be ideal, but you at least be getting someone from the realist perspective. They would be keeping the current allies, but what they wouldn't be doing is, if the current allies are engaging in war without evidence, she's not going to essentially advocate for joining in. She's going to essentially be looking for evidence first of what the actual national security needs are, and that's basically if there is a reason to do this, and if they're just basically doing it to reshape the region. Now, she's not going to be doing it to reshape the region, because that would essentially be against the actual perspective itself. The perspective would be to retain its actual current shape, and going against that would be against the actual perspective itself, and that's where we would get with that. So then that would be essentially you would have a much higher chance of peace, and this is where we would get at. And the idea of negotiations would actually be, she would be more apt to be talking on the idea of talking with people and bringing lines of communication between the different leaders to essentially negotiate for peace. Now, she would essentially expect the current leaders to stay in power, or some type of more natural transition to happen. Now, a radical transition would be something that she would be suspect with. And that might be a little bit of a problem, though I don't think that she would be as apt to go to war over an extreme position because of the change on something, like such as if those people holding Ron Paul flags were to essentially, let's say, win in an election in Venezuela. Like, let's say if they selected a leader and their leader took over for Venezuela, and if Guaido, and if the interventionist Guaido nor Maduro won an election, I don't think that she would essentially have any problems with that. Because in the end, with it, essentially, there's still when we start to look at the history of the actual nation, we can see that they've only had essentially what would be viewed as a short history of socialism. If you look at their long history with it, essentially, long history would have been essentially, they would have been capitalist beforehand, and actually pretty quite laissez-faire capitalist beforehand, which is why you would see very similarly that it's these people like that would have held up signs like that, because those would have been the people that understood the way things, that if they want the things the way they were at the height, especially the height of the 1970s and 1980s, that's kind of the way things were going, and why the people were extremely wealthy in that nation, and why there were even Americans moving down there in Venezuela, and it had nothing really to do with the oil itself. It was just, there was many more industries down there that were booming. And when we look at that now, when we look at the idea of what Gabbard could bring, is Gabbard could bring essentially the idea that's that we could have a lot more peaceful negotiations. We're actually negotiating directly with these leaders, as she was willing to actually speak with Bashar al-Assad, and speaking with him, and then instead of the insane minds like Meghan McCain, who try to accuse her of speaking with a brutal dictator, which is far from the truth, as opposed to her father, who was actually, of Meghan McCain's father, who actually met with Ansar al-Sharia and referred to them as good guys. And that's the complete, when we're looking at, that's the complete opposite. And what needs to be understood is, when you, if we want peace, we're going to have to go with someone who's willing to speak with many different types of leaders, and we're going to have to essentially negotiate and negotiate with many different types of people. Now, essentially, what would be best is if we start to cut our alliances with every country and to start speaking with the leaders themselves for diplomacy. Now, that's going to be really hard, because there's essentially alliances that have been going on for a while, and it's going to be hard to find someone that's going to be going in, that's going to have that opinion. And because there's a lot of people who feel that, oh, we should naturally have an alliance with Israel. Well, that's when we start to look at it, is, even though it doesn't make sense to have an alliance with any country, people tend to just automatically assume it without actually understanding what it actually means. Now, Tulsi Gabbard feels we should have an alliance with Israel, but I don't think that she would essentially buying into any of the war propaganda that Israel is going to be popping out with. Now, this is going to be the thing that we need to understand, is that Israel is going to be coming out with, as it does through its media, through the government itself, they're going to be popping out with a lot of war propaganda, because just as Saudi Arabia and UAE do, to essentially want to remake the Middle East, and to want to basically make Iran and Hezbollah, which is essentially just a anti-imperialism and anti-interventionist group, out to be this huge problem. When Hezbollah, if you look at their facts throughout history, is they don't intervene. All they do is they basically fight off. Hezbollah, basically, the reason why they got the bad name is because when Israel was intervening and trying to take over part of Lebanon, they basically Hezbollah came in, and they basically outlasted them and made Israel walk away with their tail between their legs. And in return is Israel felt way to get even was to essentially claim that they're a terrorist group. And because they have a very, very influential link with the United States, they are able to use their paper very much like a propaganda piece. Now, if you look at the Israel's history, you'll understand that they've always been a socialist country. Now, when it comes to economically, they take their funding elsewhere. They don't get their funding from their actual people themselves because they know it wouldn't last. They don't have the population to sustain itself. So what they do is they get this from Western nations. They've even been tried to be converted over by people like Milton Friedman. Try to convert them over and say, don't continue on this socialism. It's basically it doesn't work. And he convinced a few people to do it for to adopt the idea for a few years, but they abandoned it very, very quickly. And the fact is they're just the people who like socialism. Now, if we try to state that, if we try to look at the fact of the idea of people stating that, oh, they went down there because they were trying, they didn't like what was going on during the Holocaust and they escaped the Holocaust. Well, the fact is Hitler was a National Socialist. Well, if that were the case, why would you go right back to socialism? Now, this would be essentially where you would have gone to essentially the polar opposite. You would have gone to a laissez-faire capitalist society because you would want to essentially create nothing of the like, and you don't even want to make sure that happens. Now, what do? They're essentially running a socialist government. Well, this proves that essentially that it must have not been that this country was founded under the idea of after the World War II, like people think. No, it was actually founded well before. When you look at the real history, it was actually founded after in the Treaty of Versailles. What happened was Britain removed the Palestinians from their land. They started carving up the Middle East along with France. They gave France half of it. They took half of it, and in the land that Britain took, part of that land was Israel. They tossed all the Eastern European Jews that were in some of the poor areas in England, and they wanted a place to dump them. Well, the place they dumped them was this Palestinian land that they named Israel. And that was it. And that was essentially what happened. And that's how they got down there. That's how this country was formed. And it wasn't any other way with it when they tried to act like it was something different. That's really what it was. There wasn't any other different reason why it was formed. So when we start to look at our alliances, it really doesn't make much sense. So because we'll see people say, oh, they're a democracy like ours. Well, no, they're not. They're an actual parliament. They're actually linked with the British. They're more linked with the British government than they are with the United States. They never really were like the United States. The only country out there that's really linked with the United States style government is actually the Philippines. The Philippines is the only one that's actually taken stuff from ours. That's because they used to be part of the United States. That's why their constitution's based off ours. That's why their government is based off ours. Everything is very, very similar. So if we're talking about something very similar, it's going to be them. There's nothing really out there when it comes down to it that's any closer to ours than the Philippines. And what needs to be understood is even when it comes down to it, they even know that you're not supposed to have entangling alliances. And they've even understood this. And it's something that needs to be clearly stated. And and it's something that needs to be clearly stated with the with when we're looking at peace, and we're not going to get that necessarily with Tulsi Gabbard. She's not necessarily going to back off on the entangling alliances, but she will most likely back off on war if they're trying to push her to war. And she would definitely be an advisor that's going to basically look for peace and say, you know, we need to actually start negotiating peace over what these other countries are trying to do. And if she's getting pushed by Israel or like Saudi Arabia or UAE to basically push against it, I think she would essentially push back and look in such a way that would be beneficial for the actual nation. And that's something that would be a little bit different than what Bolton would do. Bolton essentially is going to go, what doesn't tie the country down with peace? And that's what we're seeing. He's essentially looking for sabotaging peace at every corner. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and share it all around social media. And I'll see you later today for my podcast on going over Article 1 of the Constitution. This will be going over, my stuff will be going over for the next few days, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Then I'll go over the idea of an Article 5 convention, and then the 13th Amendment. Then I'll go from there with it for what my options are going to be. I'll see what I have planned open for that from that point. But that's about it. Bye, everyone.